This is a close reading exercise in which we're going to look at this article by Stephen Kinzer. And the article is from the Boston Globe, and it's titled, "Who's Responsible for the Border Crisis? The United States." So this is the title, and this is an opinion article. And I did some intelligence on Stephen Kinzer. This is one of the important things that I do when I start to analyze an article, because it gives you ideas of where the person's coming from, what their views are, and there's this beautiful Wikipedia page about him. He's an American author, he's a journalist, he's an academic. He writes for the New York Times, and he's published several books. And then as I started to read his reporting career, I noticed that back in the 1980s, he covered the revolution of social upheaval in Central America. And he wrote this book called Bitter Fruit about the coup and destabilization of Guatemala during the 1950s. It may not make sense to you right now why I am highlighting this fact, but I know that it will become very important later on. And then I kind of skimmed through the rest of his reporting career, and then views became very important. Kinzer's reporting on Central America, which is something that we're about to read, was criticized by Edward Herman and Noam Chomsky. Noam Chomsky is a name that I know very well. This dude is actually among other things, he's an influential figure in the world of linguistics, the world that I'm really interested about and I live in. That in their book, which is Manufacturing Consent, they are talking about him, and they're saying that in his work, he hardly ever spoken to a live observer, that most of the views that he's reporting are the views of the government. We're not going to believe this little opinion on Wikipedia, because anybody can log in and change things, and we're just going to take it into consideration as we're starting to close read this article. When I close read, I like to approach it first from a bigger picture, and I like to see how long this article is. And I use this tool. It's this little guy, the rocket. It's in the corner next to the Evernote icon, to turn an article from the regular Boston Globe article online to a PDF, and then starts to look like that. And it's easier because now I know that there's 5 pages, 1 of 5. And given the font, that's pretty large. And I see how the piece is structured in really concrete paragraphs, which is helping me out a lot. First things first, let's read, and I'm going to be stopping after each and every paragraph to highlight and summarize some things. Halfway through 2019, thousands of impoverished refugees from Guatemala and Honduras remain crowded along our southern border. June is the best month to reflect on this crisis because it marks the anniversary of 2 crucial events that helped create it. Now, if I were to summarize this really quickly and take a note on margins, I would just write June. The significance of June, that there were 2 crucial events that helped create the southern border, and that is something that the article is going to cover. Next, in June 1954, that is a prepositional phrase, the United States, that is my subject, deposed a popular democratic government in Guatemala. I'm not doubting your knowledge of the word deposed, but just for some of you who may not know, it means removed from office suddenly and forcefully. So the United States deposed a popular democratic government in Guatemala. Guatemala is a proper noun. The reason it's called proper noun because it begins with a capital letter. Somehow, most of the words in our brain that begin with a capital letter, the brain views as a name of a person. So when I'm encountering a name of a person, I try to circle it. And when I encounter a proper noun that is a name of a country like Guatemala, which means it's not a person. I try to box it. And initially, it is a great strategy to separate people and non-people. 55 years later, so that's another temporal aspect, because what Stephen is trying to do here is he's trying to draw a timeline for us, connect the dots. 55 years later, in June 2009, the government of Honduras, also freely elected, was overthrown in a coup that the United States strongly endorsed. 55 years later, in 2009, the government of Honduras was also freely elected, was overthrown. So the government is a subject. The verb is was overthrown. In a coup, prepositional phrase, the word that is one of those wonderful conjunctions that add information about the word that comes immediately before. What kind of coup? It was the coup that United States strongly endorsed. Both of these Central American countries succumbed to waves of repression and violence. Refugees at our border are fleeing horrific conditions. They're in part the long-term results of the interventions in their homelands. So both of these Central American countries succumbed. So both is the subject. Succumbed is the verb to waves of repression and violence. That's actually a conjunction, but of repression and violence, let's say this is one big prepositional phrase. Refugees is the subject of the last sentence in this paragraph. At our border, that is a prepositional phrase. Are fleeing is the verb. What are they fleeing? To flee is a transitive or an intransitive verb. This is a transitive verb because it needs an object. What are they fleeing? Fleeing horrific conditions. And again, the word that, it's a powerful conjunction that adds essential information about those horrific conditions that are in part the long-term results of American interventions. The important part about this paragraph, in my opinion, is the word interventions. If I were to collapse this four-sentence paragraph, I would say that it gives us the timeline of what United States did to Guatemala, what they did 55 years later to Honduras, and what it resulted in, because both of these countries succumbed to repression and refugees are fleeing horrific conditions that were created by interventions. If I were to just take some notes on the margins, I would probably say two interventions, and then horrific conditions. I'm just going to write it here. Two interventions, horrific conditions. It feels like to me that this is where our author, Stephen Kinzer, is setting up his thesis. This is where he says, that is what I'm going to tell you. I'm going to demonstrate these two interventions, and I'm going to show you exactly how those interventions happened and how they affected the economy in these two particular countries, Guatemala and Honduras, and how they have created the crisis. But let's see if he does that. In the next paragraph, this paragraph, if I'm just previewing it, if I'm just scanning this really quickly, I'm noticing that there's Uncle Tom's Cabin and there's Darwin. Some of the names like Topsy, they pop from the page for me. And I'm going to expect something more of a metaphor from the author here. Before Darwin discovered the science of evolution, that is our dependent clause. This is kind of like sets up the main idea. Species, subject, were said, verb, To have burst out from nothingness. To have burst out from nothingness. The first one is a verbial phrase. This one is a prepositional phrase. Through a natural magic called spontaneous generation. Americans often look at the world crises the same way. Well, after you read the first sentence, you're wondering why would he start talking about spontaneous generation and about Darwin and about natural magic? Well, now he actually explains it to you in the second sentence right here. Americans often look at the world crises the same way. The same way is depicting this, which is things just burst out. They burst out from nothingness. Things just happen. What he implies here is that Americans are overlooking a lot of the interconnectedness of events, that a border crisis doesn't just happen, that economic hardships don't just happen. They actually come out as a result of things happening outside of the country, or maybe some interventions. We think of their origin the way Topsy is a circle, thought of hers in the Uncle Tom's Cabin. That's the name of the book. We're going to box it. I expect I growed. I don't think nobody ever made me. Well, if you know a little bit about history, you probably know that Darwin created the evolution theory back in 19th century, and it was exactly in 1859. And Uncle Tom's Cabin was written, if my memories don't fail me, in 1952. So naturally, if something was published before, the Darwin's theory was created, that they didn't know how things were interconnected and evolved. I don't think nobody ever made me. Topsy did not understand where she came from. We too have trouble realizing that our problems in the world have causes. To understand the desperation driving Guatemalan and Honduran migrants, it helps to recognize our own role in creating it. To understand the desperation driving Guatemalan and Honduran immigrants, what is that? That is a verbial phrase. That is kind of like a verbial opener. It is the subject, helps is the verb. To recognize our own role is a verbial phrase. In creating it is going to be a prepositional phrase. So if we were to summarize this, what I would take notes of on the margins, I would say interconnectedness. This is terrible handwriting, but I promise you it says interconnectedness. And then I would also say Americans fail. And this would remind me to say that Americans fail to recognize the interconnectedness of events, as if we don't know about the evolution theory that Darwin created back in, or realized back in 1859. And in order to understand why we have this crisis, we have to recognize our role in creating this. So this is, I think, is more like the transition into the rest of the article. To understand the desperation driving Guatemalan and Honduran migrants, it helps to recognize our role in creating this. So Americans fail to recognize the interconnectedness, our role in it. And by it, which is a pronoun, I mean the driving forces of Guatemalan and Honduran immigrants to flee their own countries. Next paragraph, Guatemala and Honduras. One more box. And then something that is surrounded by dashes, which means we're just going to clarify the exact aspects of Guatemala and Honduras, because we can approach it and we can view these two countries as struggling countries, or countries that have a particular population, have particular industries. But the way the author wants to look at these is the Central American countries closest to the United States. He is approaching, he's viewing it from the perspective of a map. So the fact that these countries are bordering on the southern border, terrible map, but you get the picture, are plagued by violence and dominated by corrupt thugs. They were not always so unfortunate. So yes, right now, things are bad, but they were not always so unfortunate. Both, another subject, which is a collective pronoun, both went through, is the verb. What did they go through? Promising periods of stability and progress. Projects of national development in Central America, however, always faced opposition from the United States. Projects is the subject of national development in Central America. These are two prepositional phrases together. However, always faced. Projects, always faced. Face is a transitive verb, which needs an object. What did they face? They faced opposition from the United States, another prepositional phrase. Leaders is our new subject, who promoted social reform. Then, as you notice that there are two dashes right here, and who sought to pull their countries out of Washington's orbit. Leaders who did all of that. This is where this clarification about the leaders ends. Become is a linking verb. Targets. What did they become? Targets of our wrath. I don't necessarily doubt your knowledge of the word wrath, but in case you don't know, it stands for extreme anger. If we were to, we need to finish reading this paragraph. By striking down these leaders and supporting autocratic regimes instead, that is a verbial opener, comma. Right after comma, we're going to see our subject. The United States, subject, pushed. Verb, pushed is a transitive verb. Pushed who? Guatemala and Honduras off the path towards democracy. The United States pushed these countries off the path toward democracy, prepositional phrase. So the main sentence is United States pushed Guatemala and Honduras off the path. Today's refugee caravans are a legacy of those interventions. So refugee caravans are, to be verb, what are they? They are a legacy of those interventions. Now, if we were to quickly summarize this, in spoken speech, I would say, yes, Guatemala and Honduras are in terrible economic plight, but it hasn't always been this way. When they were trying to improve things, Americans always pushed them off the path toward democracy. And not always would remind me about that things haven't always been this way. The U.S. pushed off the democratic path. So far, he's making a lot of statements, which are very bald and accusational, but he hasn't really provided a lot of evidence. And it looks like that in the next paragraph, he's about to do so. In one of the most dramatic political transitions in Latin American history, Guatemala moved from old-style dictatorship to electoral democracy following a peaceful uprising in 1944. The sentence is quite long, begins with a prepositional phrase, in, blah, 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 Latin American history. It's one big, long, complex prepositional phrase that gives us a temporal aspect of this and actually gives us the significance of what he's about to say. Guatemala, subject, moved, verb, from old-style dictatorship to electoral democracy. From to is a paired preposition. From old-style dictatorship to electoral democracy, I'm pretty sure that's how you pronounce it, but I would not know. Following a peaceful uprising is a verbial phrase with ing. It's the participle one. And then in 1944, that is another prepositional phrase. President Jacob Arbenz, there you go, let's circle him because he's a dude, proclaimed That's going to be our verb. So president is the subject. Proclaimed his determination. He proclaimed is a transitive verb. We need an object. His determination to convert Guatemala from a backward country with a predominantly feudal economy into a modern capitalist state. That happened back in 1944. That led him into conflict with Boston-based United Fruit Company. United Fruit Company is a proper noun, and it's the name of the company, not the name of a person, because usually when we think about conflict, we're thinking about conflict with a person. Here, Jacob Arbenz now is arguing with a corporation, which is a United States-based corporation, because Boston is in the United States, which owns vast plantations in Guatemala. So the United Fruit Company owns plantations in Guatemala. Jacob Arbenz is doing something to the country, which is doing something to the feudal aspect of the economy, and it pisses the United Fruit Company off. President Dwight Eisenhower sent the CIA to overthrow him. When you click on this link, it actually takes you to one of the books that Stephen Kinzer has authored. It's called Bitter Fruit. And I knew we were going to get to this. So he actually published a full book where he provides all the evidence for this actually happening. I might consider reading this in the future because this seems like a very cute read. So this is your first solid piece of evidence. There was this president in Guatemala where in 1944 he was trying to overthrow things, change things up in the economy. And what did the United States do? They sent a CIA agent to overthrow him. On June 27, 1954, actually, what I forgot to do is I forgot to summarize this paragraph, and I just wanted to narrow it down to the most important things so that I'm going to keep those things in the forefront of my brain, and it will give me essential information to continue understanding the rest of the article. So we're just going to say CIA Fruit Company. On June 27, 1954. Again, another opener that gives us a temporal aspect. After an intense campaign, after is one of those subordinating conjunctions, which means this is either a phrase or a dependent clause. After intense campaign, that, again, let me tell you more about the campaign, that involved everything from to, remember, this is a paired preposition, from radio propaganda to aerial bombardment, comma, turns out to be a phrase, not even a clause. All of this. So there are two, phrase number one, phrase number two, phrase number three, that begins the sentence. And the main subject is government collapsed. His is a pronoun. So whose government? The United States government, the President Dwight government, or perhaps it's Jacob Arbenz. Jacob Arbenz's government collapsed almost 10 years later. A few years later, civil war broke out. Civil war broke out. It lasted for 3 decades. Oh my goodness, that's kind of important. And took the lives of more than 200,000 people, and most of them Maya Indians. Big number. Guatemala, subject, has fallen, verb. Under is a preposition, so that's going to be a prepositional phrase. Under the sway of drug traffickers and murderous urban gangs. So Guatemala has fallen, transitive verb, has fallen under the sway of drug traffickers, murderous urban gangs. Things are bad. Even trekking 2,000 miles along Mexico to be thrown into a border prison, many Guatemalans have concluded is a better option than waiting to be killed at home. Well, first and foremost, horrendous sentence. horrendous meaning of the sentence, but the way it's structured is quite interesting. Even trekking is going to be our subject. For those of you who don't know what trekking is to go on a long and arduous journey, and typically trekking is on foot. Even trekking 2,000 miles across Mexico to be thrown into a border prison, all of this is just clarifying the type of trekking. Many Guatemalans have concluded, do you see how it's offset by commas on both sides, which means essentially we can just take it out of the sentence. Is a to-be verb, so trekking is a better option. What kind of option? That waiting to be killed at home. I think this has to be then. Yeah, it's better than. Wow, we found a typo in a Boston Globe article. How amazing is that? But who cares? We are not about typos, we are about comprehension. So even trekking is a better option than waiting to be killed at home. And that's what has happened in Guatemala as the result of a direct intervention by the President White's CIA agents who were looking to protect the economic interest of the United Fruit Company, which Jacob Arbenz was trying to fight against, but he wasn't directly against the fruit company. He was predominantly focused on eradicating the feudal economy. So if we were to summarize this really quickly, and we can say civil war, trekking, prison, better. Yeah, things are bad. Also, we can say 30 years, 200,000 lives were taken. These are some facts. These are some really juicy information that will help us make a more compelling and interesting article that is based in facts, that's grounded in reality. Next, we're going to talk about Honduras. Honduras is the subject, has a comparable history. So now we're going to draw a parallel. Americans first deposed, and if you guys remember what the word deposed means, it means they remove from office suddenly and forcefully. Americans first deposed a president of Honduras in 1911. So this intervention things have history. Americans deposed. Who did they depose? Transitive verb. President of Honduras. Semicolon. What does that mean? That means there's two independent clauses that are connected with a semicolon. What it means for us as readers is that there are two separate ideas that are interconnected. His sin was borrowing money from European banks rather than the JP Morgan. Whew, I cannot believe. So his sin is the subject, is the verb, which is a to be verb, was what? Borrowing money from rather than. So Americans were unhappy because the percent on the debt he was paying to European banks rather than to JP Morgan. Yet, although Honduras remained poor during the mid-20th century, it enjoyed a measure of social peace. Yet, although Hondurans remained poor during the mid-20th century, this is a DC, and then it is the subject, enjoyed is the verb. Enjoyed is a transitive verb, so we need an object, a measure of social peace. So in the 1950s, there was some peace happening in Honduras. That ended abruptly in 1980s. So 1950s, 1980s, things were getting better. That ended abruptly in 1980s. I guess something happened, and guess what? The next sentence boasts the subject. The United States turned the verb. What did they turn? They turned Honduras into a base for the Contra force, fighting leftist rule in the neighboring Nicaragua. They basically militarized them. Things were good and peaceful for 30 years, and then the United States interfered. Many who protested were killed by police-sponsored death squads, which had never before been seen in Honduras. So Honduras gets sponsorship from the United States, and they are asked to fight against the leftist rule in Nicaragua. Oh my goodness. So if I were to summarize this, Honduras, JP Morgan, 1911, and then Nicaragua, Contra force. Well, we can imagine what kind of consequences this led to. In recent years, Honduras, like Guatemala, had been devastated by return of citizens who fled during the 1980s. All the citizens that were scared to stay in the country during the 1980s absorbed gang culture in Los Angeles, another proverbial phrase, offset by commas on both sides, and brought it back home after being deported. It's kind of a curious sentence. In recent years, in Honduras, so Honduras is the subject, has been devastated is the verb. Let me just erase all of this. I have too many markings. The sentence is a bit confusing to understand, so let's go through this. Honduras is the subject. Like Guatemala, that is a noun phrase or a positive, however you want to do it. Noun phrase. Has been devastated is going to be the verb. By the return of citizens, what kind of citizens? Who fled during the 1980s. Now, absorbed gang culture in Los Angeles, that's offset by commas. That's just like another addition about the citizens, and brought it back home after being deported. There's a comma and here, but it doesn't mean that there's another independent clause, because brought it back home after being deported, there's no subject, but there's a verb. But the reason there's a comma here, if you are interested in polishing your grammar, is because absorbed gang culture in Los Angeles is offset by commas on both sides. If I were the editor here, which I never will be, I would actually suggest that we offset it by dashes to remove any type of confusion. Because anytime a reader sees comma and, a light bulb goes off in their head thinking, it's a comma and it's a fanboy. I think that there's two independent clauses connected to each other, which means I'm going to have two really separate and independent ideas. But that's not what's happening here, because sometimes you can just have a comma in front of and as a part of a construct. A socialist-oriented president of Honduras, Manuel Zelaya, fought to ease these tensions with social reforms. President sought to would be a transitive verb, ease these tensions with social reforms. He increased the minimum wage, poured money into wretched education system, and encouraged protest against entrenched interests. So he did a lot of great things. Even worse, from Washington's perspective, was his support of other leftist leaders like Hugo Chavez of Venezuela. So he started to do some really big things in the light of all of these refugees coming back to the country in the recent years because of our immigration policy. Everybody who fled in the 1980s and became undocumented and is now being deported back to their original countries. And those people had absorbed the gang culture, and they obviously brought it back home. Wealthy Hondurans, let me tell you more about those who detested him, read signals from Washington. read signals. Did they read sign language? No, they actually perhaps were talking, and perhaps there was a collusion with Washington, between Washington officials, the United States officials, and wealthy Hondurans. Before dawn on June 28th, 2009, a squad, that's my subject, what kind of squad of soldiers, swooped down, that's my verb, on Zelaya's home, pulled him out of bed, threw him onto a plane while he was still in his pajamas, and flew him out of the country. So, that's quite an intervention. Let's quickly summarize this. This is just like we had a president in 1944 in Guatemala. If you guys remember what his name was Jacobo Arbenz. This country had Honduras had Manuel Zelaya. 1944, Manuel Zelaya. Refugees, social, wealthy Hondurans. And then maybe we draw a plane. And that is a terrible looking plane, but it's okay. Yep. And it makes sense that wealthy Hondurans, they detested him, which means they disliked him a lot. That was because he was trying to raise the minimum wage, and if you had a factory, then you would have to pay a lot more. Then in a cable to the State Department, in a cable, like there wasn't, not talking about like a cable, rather like in the message or like a telegram, in a cable to the State Department, that is where, revealed by WikiLeaks, that is a noun phrase that is beautifully offset by dashes on both sides. The United States ambassador, that's my subject, to Honduras, called this what it is, an illegal and unconstitutional coup. Our own ambassador says it's an illegal and unconstitutional coup. The United Nations, the European Union, and the Organization of American States agreed, all of these organizations agreed, and demanded Zelaya's return. Washington, subject, refused to allow it. Several members of Congress flew to Honduras to congratulate the new regime. So, several members flew to Honduras to congratulate the new regime. To congratulate the new regime is a verbial phrase. Pardon this little child that's crying outside. Poor him or her. Secretary of State, Hillary Clinton. Secretary of State or Hillary Clinton, we'll just make that the subject, who saw the coup as a win over anti-American forces in the hemisphere, that is her position, become as one of those linking verbs. Who did she become? One of its chief promoters. So Hillary Clinton became one of the chief promoters of the winning new regime. Wow. In 10 years since then, another temporal aspect, the regime, subject, has held, verb, power, because to hold, transitive verb, they have power through electoral fraud, and has tolerated waves of violence in which dozens of activists, especially environmental protesters, have been murdered. So the regime held power through electoral fraud. Wow. So what I'm going to say here in the margins is that U.S. ambassador, as someone who's going to tell the truth, and then Washington, Hillary Clinton, and violence. And then the activists are not allowed to speak up. Wow. The very last paragraph. The U.S.-led invasion of the U.S.-led invasion of Iraq, invasion is the subject, was not, to be verb, was not, the only American intervention, what kind of intervention, that had horrible consequences. Many others have also ended badly. Not everything awful that has happened in Guatemala and Honduras is the fault of the United States. Nonetheless, we have decisively shaped these countries' destinies and, so this is another independent clause, because we, is the subject, have shaped, is the verb, those countries' destinies, and so cannot consider ourselves blameless. Not really another independent clause. Babies torn from their families at the detention centers along with southern border are the children of our past interventions. Wow, what a powerful, powerful ending. The conclusion is basically concludes the interventions of the United States in Guatemala and Honduras in the light of all the interventions that had terrible consequences. And it says that not everything awful has happened in Guatemala and Honduras is the fault of the United States. Nonetheless, we have decisively, we knew what we were doing, shaped the destinies of these countries. And we cannot consider ourselves blameless. This is a beautiful metaphor. And this is kind of like the circular composition, because we started with the babies and we ended with the babies. Wow. Good job. Now, what I'm going to do with my next step is I'm going to try to reverse engineer the outline that this Stephen Kinzer, the author, that he had. And perhaps he had an outline that was more expansive than I'm going to create. But if we're just starting, I think it makes sense to start small and to just narrow it down to introduction, body paragraph 1, body paragraph, it's a bad B, body paragraph 2, body paragraph 3, and then a conclusion. Each of the body paragraphs is going to have a topic sentence, and I'm going to try to express it to the best of my ability, verbally and in writing. The introduction was in one of the first parts right here, and I think that June being an important part of why he's writing it right now, because it's the anniversary of two crucial events. It's the overthrowing of both presidents in Guatemala and Honduras. Both happened in June. And now we're talking about how in 1954, the United States deposed a popular democratic government in Guatemala, and then 55 years later, the government of Honduras, also freely elected, was overthrown. So, two interventions, horrific consequences. The United States intervened into the history of H and G, which led to horrific consequences and eventually contributed to the immigration crisis. I'm just going to call it immigration crisis on the southern border. That is kind of my intro, one sentence. Body paragraph 1. If you remember, the author was talking about here about Darwin and about Topsy, a very kind of a background character in Uncle Tom's Cabin, and yet he brings it up and says that it would be okay for Americans to overlook the interconnectedness of their effects, but it is absolutely unacceptable because we're no longer in 1852. So one of the things that is going to be a part of a body paragraph, I don't have a topic sentence yet, but one of the things is fail to acknowledge the interconnectedness. Connectedness. Now, another thing that could be a part of the first body paragraph, or the first kind of cluster of thoughts, is Guatemala and Honduras, the Central American countries, plagued by violence and dominated. They were not always so unfortunate. Both went through promising periods, however, always faced the opposition. I think this is going to be the topic sentence. Leaders became targets of our wrath. The United States pushed Guatemala and Honduras off the path toward democracy. Today's refugees caravans are a legacy of those interventions. Wow. So perhaps caravans equal legacy of interventions. Then faced objections from US, the United States. I'm going to, because this is about the United States, so I'm going to try to begin all the body paragraphs with the subject as the United States. The United States pushed Guatemala and Honduras off the democratic path is going to be the topic sentence of the first body paragraph. Now, body paragraph 2, we got to scroll down just a little bit further. And this is where the author is talking about Jacobo Arbenz, and that's his example with a fruit company. Actually, for what it's worth, this dude wrote a whole book about this. And then 10 years later, consequences that led to a civil war. Now, the U.S. has intervened has intervened into the H and G elections many times. So the first would be Jacobo Arbenz. Jacobo Arbenz was trying to, that is going to be another, he was trying to fight feudal economy, which pissed the fruit company and if it disappoints a fruit company, then the CIA agent gets sent from Eisenhower. Now, I think I'm going to lower this a little bit. what happened to Honduras, what happened to Guatemala as a consequence of him being not overthrown, but his campaign was destroyed as a consequence of this. What happened was the Civil War. And I remember making markings about it having lasting 30 years. 200,000 lives were lost, and now there's a lot of negative consequences in the economy because of that war. Now, this was all about Guatemala. Now let's talk about Honduras. In Honduras, the United States intervened at least twice. The first intervention was 1911. It was with a president who was not willing to borrow money from J.P. Morgan. And then another story was about President Manuel Zelaya, who he was a socialist, so he wanted to rise the people who were very poor, which obviously disappointed the wealthy guys. And the fact that he was friends with Hugo Chavez, and that he wanted to increase the minimum wage. Wealthy Hondurans colluded with White House, with the White House. And they kidnapped him. And the last body paragraph is dedicated to B3, is dedicated to the U.S. refuses in the present tense, refuses to acknowledge or take responsibility. And this was the point about them refusing to allow it, how Hillary Clinton, so there was a ambassador, the U.S. ambassador in Honduras, who called it an unconstitutional coup. Constitutional, you get the picture. Unconstitutional coup. And if you guys are losing track of what it is, I'm talking about the kidnapping of Manuel Zelaya. And so the ambassador says that's an unconstitutional coup, but America refuses to acknowledge it, even though the UN, the American Association of States, and then the European Union, ESC, I'm not sure what the acronym is, but like the current European Union, they all agreed, but America says, nope, never happened. More than that, Hillary Clinton, who was the Secretary of State back then, she flies and she says, no, what these people are saying, they are basically a part of the anti-American group. And she goes in and she supports the new regime, which came after President Zelaya was kidnapped. And the new regime is undergoing a lot of hardships, and they are using all sorts of electoral fraud to stay in power. And they are arresting protesters. Now, in conclusion, babies of interventions are the babies of southern border. That is the conclusion that this author is drawing. I know I've forgotten about how Honduras had been militarized, and because for 30 years between 1850 and 1950 and 1980, things were pretty peaceful. I'm also forgetting how a lot of Hondurans and Guatemalans are actually choosing to trek the through Mexico and be imprisoned in America, as opposed to become prisoners of their own countries. And it's okay because you're not going to remember everything that came from the article, but just the effort of creating something like this will create a tremendous mental dexterity in your mind and help you read more articles like this one. So I hope that helped. And what I would suggest you do is you can type this up if you wanted to. And I would also suggest that you try to speak about this in complete sentences out loud with your notes closed. And this will help you create the mental path of cause and effect. Cause and effect, or a bold statement and detailed proof. Bold statement, detailed proof. Yep. Hope you found this helpful. Bye.